And it's quite lovely as a member of this department to experience the enthusiasm that people have for it. I bask in that, although I know that most of it is due to my colleague, John Lachs. In any case, Eric, please come up and enlighten us.
Thank you so much, Michael. I have to use my computer because I didn't get a chance to print either, as John noted yesterday, but that's okay. So, it is an honor to be here. Thank you very much. I met John Lachs in Furman Hall at Vanderbilt University in the spring of 1998 and have been his student ever since. After taking all the courses I could from John and graduating from Vanderbilt, I missed his classes. I collected his books and articles, which he writes with clarity, prose, the prose of a poet, and irrepressible humor and joy. John is the quintessential publicly engaged philosopher, a prolific author, and a profoundly inspiring teacher, as well as a mentor to countless students and scholars. I could not feel more fortunate, therefore, to have the opportunity to comment on his work and on the ideas and concerns he has attended to with care. John, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you for all that your instruction and mentorship and friendship has done to make my life immeasurably better. That's all the nice stuff I'm going to say. For the present celebration of and engagement with John's work, I'll focus on the ways in which his philosophical insights have enriched my thinking about the philosophy of education, while also exposing worries and challenges that call for continued attention and examination. In particular, John is a passionate defender of freedom. There's little doubt that liberty is of profound importance in education. Yet freedom and its corollaries raise complications in a number of ways that I will note in this paper. A flip side of John's defense of freedom takes the form of his calls to stop, quote, meddling, reminding us of the value in leaving others alone. Next, John's revolutionary essay, Human Natures, which we've already heard about, and consequent writings challenge philosophers to question deeply important assumptions at the root of great differences in thinking about politics and education, which also bear meaningful implications for public schooling. Connecting these themes, I will argue here that while liberty raises profound problems in the spheres of public education, democratic education is enriched immeasurably when it enables and empowers the freedom to pursue diverse forms of flourishing. I'll begin with a look at the ways in which John's philosophy aligns supportively with the best of what democratic education should be. I'll then raise concerns about some challenges for embracing freedom in education, from the unavoidable to the grossly unjust. John has advocated for freedom in many spheres, from the selling of organs to end-of-life decision-making. In education, he has called for change in undergraduate programming to better serve the interests of students and to diminish the unnecessary constraints of excessive core curricular bloat. John is in good company in championing the importance of liberty in education. First, Plato's allegory of the cave, his famous way of understanding education, begins with the release of prisoners from chains, with liberation from constraints of perceiving and thinking. Plato's Socrates in the Republic does not appear to be a great friend to liberty, yet he argues rightly that, quote, the free man ought not to learn any study slavishly. Forced labors performed by the body don't make the body any worse, but no forced study abides in the soul. End quote. Jean-Jacques Rousseau agrees even more forcefully in his major work, Emile, or On Education. Rousseau sees society and civilization as degenerating and constraining, while a person's nature is good as it comes from the hand of, quote, the author, end quote. The key then for Rousseau is to keep young people free from the degenerating forces of society and to cultivate the powers of their naturally springing individuality. Unfortunately, Rousseau failed to recognize the degenerating force of his and his society's misogyny and other vices, yet he does argue in Emile, at least, that, quote, in the natural order, all men are equal, end quote. And In stark contrast with Plato's authoritarianism in the Republic, Rousseau writes that, quote, "The only one who does his own will is he who, in order to do it, has no need to put another's arms at the end of his own, from which it follows that the first of all goods is not authority, but freedom. The truly free man wants only what he can do, and does what he pleases. That is my fundamental maxim. It need only be applied to childhood for all the rules of education to flow from it." While Rousseau champions freedom here, he nevertheless falls short of advocating for public education and speaks to concerns that arise in raising and educating a wealthy boy by means of a private paid governor, his imagined Emile and himself in those roles. At the same time, while Rousseau advocates for liberty, he makes clear that what he calls for is, quote, well-regulated freedom. Many people forget that the start of the Second Amendment begins with a well-regulated. I'll stop there. Okay. Dare I expose the greatest, most important, the most useful rule of all education, Rousseau asks us? It is not to gain time, but to lose it. The most dangerous period of human life is that from birth to the age of 12. This is the time when errors and vices germinate without one's yet having any instrument for destroying them. And by the time the instrument comes, the roots are so deep that it is too late to rip them out. Children ought to do nothing with their soul until all of its faculties have developed, because while the soul is yet blind, it cannot perceive the torch you are presenting to it, or follow the path reason maps out across the vast plain of ideas, a path which is so faint even to the best of eyes. End quote. At this point, Rousseau raises then an important question for champions of freedom. If they agree, and even more so if they do not, what is well-regulated freedom for students? A minimum consideration today could take the form of prohibitions on knives and firearms from campuses in K-12 institution. Yet debate on these matters continues when it comes to college campuses with their adult student populations. John Dewey also championed the centrality of freedom in education and in democratic society generally. In Creative Democracy, the Task Before Us, he writes that the democratic belief in the principle of leadership is a generous one. It is universal. It is belief in the capacity of every person to lead his own life free from coercion and imposition by others, provided right conditions are supplied. End quote. Here we see both the importance of freedom and its corollary, freedom from coercion, on which Lachs has contributed substantially. Freedom from others' meddling is a piece of the belief in democracy. With respect to schooling in democracy and education, Dewey articulates the three purposes of schools as he sees them, in which the third includes the aim of seeing to it that, quote, each individual gets an opportunity to escape the limitations of the social group in which he is born, in which he was born, and to come into living contact with a broader environment, end quote. Each of these thinkers' considerations about freedom in education bears resonances with Lachs' defenses of liberty, yet in different ways raise challenges to which I will return. Among these major philosophers of education, only Dewey seems to match Lachs' attention to the diversity and variety of human beings who are to be educated, a point that I think I heard Michael make yesterday. In Human Natures, Lachs' very title is revolutionary and controversial. Human nature is typically thought to be singular. Human beings vary, but our most essential characteristics, those ways in which we flourish, are thought to follow a set of patterns and considerations applicable to the human family due to our common nature. While Dewey saw great value in thinking about commonalities of human beings across societies, he also differed profoundly from Rousseau and Plato before him. As I mentioned, Rousseau's misogyny is clear evidence of his failure to appreciate how diverse people can be, how mistaken were his beliefs about the essential characteristics of people, such as on his unjustified divisions based on gender. Plato saw human nature as involving a small set of classes, calling for relevant social castes as a result. By contrast, Dewey challenged such thinking, given Darwin's profound influence on him, as well as Dewey's embrace of democracy. He argues in Democracy and Education that Plato lacked, quote, the perception of the uniqueness of every individual, his incommensurability with others, end quote. He explains that, quote, while Plato affirmed with emphasis that the place of the individual in society should not be determined by birth or wealth, or any conventional status, but by his own nature, as discovered in the process of education, he had no perception of the uniqueness of individuals. For him, they fall by nature into classes and into a very small number of classes at that. Consequently, the testing and sifting function of education only shows to which of three classes an individual belongs. It's a long quote, but it's almost done. There being no recognition that each individual constitutes his own class, there can be no recognition of the infinite diversity of active tendencies and combinations of tendencies of which an individual is capable. For Plato, Dewey concludes, there were only three types of faculties or powers in the individual's constitution, hence education would soon reach a static limit in each class, for only diversity makes change in progress. I think there's a lot of people and administrators who need to learn from Dewey about the value of diversity. It is meaningful, but we need to keep in mind how and why. Like Dewey, Lachs argues that as individuals, people cannot justifiably be classed only into small sets of characteristics like Plato's. He goes further, however, and notes that a key way of understanding human nature is to consider its bearing on what it means for people to live virtuous lives, for them to thrive and flourish. The variety of ways in which that can happen is arguably infinite, which is not to say limitless. The distinction is important and can be understood by analogy to mathematics. The set of positive numbers is infinite, but it is limited. The set does not include negative numbers. By the same token, people's natures can be infinitely varied, yet that does not mean that any which way of living will enable virtue or flourishing. Lachs' solution on that score is generally to call for leaving others alone, so long as the way they live does not harm or interfere with others' exercise of liberty. The problem with this response is the obligation society bears for all children, an issue to which I will return shortly. So much philosophy that rests on valuing liberty behaves like Rousseau, wanting to skip over the sticky period of children's youth, right? In which young people are thought not yet capable of reasoning as adults. Lachs identifies the concept of human nature as choice inclusive. That means that objective facts will not determine for all what it means or is. Instead, human nature is a concept about which humans debate and draw on various values and concerns, as we've noted already during the first discussions of the present conference. Human natures, in the plural, is a way of thinking that recognizes plurality and diversity and calls for avoiding unnecessary problematic assumptions. Dewey would applaud this way of thinking as it emphasizes democratic respect for difference and openness and adaptability that changing environments demand. At the same time, it is indeed, as Dr. Stewart noted yesterday, vital to persuade fellow citizens of the importance of teaching the young the value of diversity and of empowering all people to flourish despite their differences. Problems to which I will turn next include resistance to exactly these kinds of aims. Nevertheless, to the extent that education can be conducted in such a manner as to promote students' powers and freedoms with an eye to growth and diversity, it represents the truest and most meaningful practices that it can pursue. As Dewey argued, there is no progress without diversity and change. In advancing such goals, however, deep challenges arise, ranging, as I have indicated at the outset, from the unavoidable to the grossly unjust. So the first problem that arises with regard to freedom in democratic educational context is that schooling must be compulsory. If all people are to have a say in how society is to be led, then it is vital that they be educated. Consent, in contrast with coercion, requires knowledge and understanding. We may not be able to guarantee these conditions, yet we can assure that they will not obtain for the vast majority of people if we fail to ensure a universal public education. Compulsory education, then, appears to run counter to the norm of freedom in education, but this is not entirely so. It is the case that people must be educated, but how they're educated and about what can leave significant room for freedom. As it stands, the most powerful limitation of compulsory education is presence. Students have to attend school unless their parents have applied for homeschooling or sent their kids to private school. Even then, the participation in private school is not supposed to be optional. Truancy officers seek out truant children and work to deliver them to schools. Once young people arrive at school, however, they can be asked to participate in activities, yet very few consequences ensue when they choose not to participate. To be sure, their academic records suffer, but young people can easily have little sense of why that matters. Among the important insights Lachs philosophy offers with the support of Dewey and Rousseau is recognition of the value of connecting with students' interests. Giving students space to explore stimulating environments can enable freedom for individuals to develop their powers and to engage in play that leads to learning. Rousseau argues that the ideal for his imaginary pupil, Emile, is to immerse him in a workshop. He writes, quote, "If instead of gluing a child to books, I bury him in a workshop, his hands work for the profit of his mind, he becomes a philosopher and believes he is a laborer. Finally, it will be seen how from the games of philosophy one can arise to the true function of man." Dewey similarly argues that true education connects to students' interests and that it is ideal to render schoolwork play, so that students learn without compulsion, but participate together in enjoyable activities that nevertheless teach them. They behave freely and with pleasure and interest, yet learn. This approach stands in stark contrast to the training for state testing in environments in which corporal punishment is still used in 19 states in the U.S., including in rural Tennessee and in Kentucky, where I live, among other places. If schooling is to be compulsory, then, it is essential to ensure that students are empowered to participate actively and by choice in various ways of engagement in their education. It is also necessary that the environment be inviting, welcoming, and not harsh or unpleasant. Otherwise, schools will feel like prisons. The closest examples available for the model I have in mind are probably Montessori schools. Yet the freedom desired, as Rousseau explained, is well regulated. And the quality of that regulation can easily vary significantly from school to school. In addition, most Montessori schools are private. There are 6 public Montessori schools in the state of Kentucky with a population of 4.5 million people. One can, not in the Montessori schools, but in the state. One can hear in these facts the significant distance found between present practices and more freedom-promoting forms of schooling. A second problem for promoting freedom and diversity in education comes from those concerned about another aspect of liberty, namely taxation. Public schooling in my home state of Kentucky can be considered in terms of the $6.3 billion that the state is investing for the next year in the State Department of Education, as one example of a funding source and amount. When tax dollars are spent on any endeavor, people want a sense that their money is well spent and not wasted. This understandable expectation has been coupled, however, with tragically diminishing forms of evaluations, which take the form of regular testing, often that we call standardized. There are several problems that come from what is often referred to as accountability culture in public schools. First, consider that private schools are largely free from the relevant expectations, right? Aside from occasional tests like SATs and ACTs, on which the relevant population typically scores higher than less wealthy ones. So despite the lowered expectation for accountability, sufficient privilege and wealth leads to stronger performance. Consider Dewey's famous norm, which says that what the best parents want for their children, so should society want for all its children. Of course, by best parents, Dewey did not or should not mean the wealthiest parents, but they're the ones who have choices and who have opportunities to pick. The point here is that choosy parents with the resources to make choices generally steer away from education that focuses on narrow test preparations. One consequence of this troubling feature of accountability culture is the narrowing effect it has on school curriculum. When reading and math scores are taken to be of central importance for people's assessments of the quality of schools, school leaders, unsurprisingly, pressure teachers to shift their focus away from other parts of the curriculum, incentivizing a radical narrowing of the curriculum and school time to test preparation. And what is not tested is thereby not valued. Yet another consequence of this, and related to this, is that teachers lose freedom to educate students according to their own strengths and powers. Finally, the omnipresence of test scores lends itself to the frequent mistaken interpretations people draw from data. Diane Ravitch, who served under both Republican and Democratic administrations in the U.S. Department of Education, has argued that schooling is being reigned by error. Her book is called Reign of Error. With countless and powerful forces applying pressure on schools based on misinterpretations of educational data. For one quick example, she cites people's disbelief at the fact that only 25% of students at the relevant time were proficient at reading at grade level. The problem, of course, is that the everyday word proficient has a technical meaning, right? Which refers to receiving a high B or an A. What proportion of students should earn an A? If 75% of them did, Americans would rightly say that expectations for reading are too low. Basic reading levels are a grade of C or better, and more than 75% of students read at that level, which Ravitch believes is close to what we should expect and want if our expectations are sufficiently high. A last point to mention here is that in the realm of special education, a tool has been developed that is only applied to a minority of students, namely the Individuals with Disabilities Act's concept of an individualized education plan. What a wonderful idea. My daughter has one. In my own thinking, an ideal for the future, which people laugh at me when I say this, but I imagine people have laughed at lots of philosophers' ideas, right? In my own thinking, an ideal for the future would be to find a way to establish educational policy so that every student is afforded an individualized education plan. Even if they're made to take occasional tests regarding their educational progress. Keep in mind that when we talk about educational standards and accountability culture, these norms and challenges arise in part out of the call to leave others alone, to minimize meddling, because we tax people, because we compel, and so forth. When we interfere in people's lives, when we tax, high expectations ensue for how that money is used. While this is understandable, the extent of accountability culture is not matched with sufficient understanding of educational data, and the cart of accountability and testing should not be placed before the horse of curriculum and intelligent education promoting diversity and freedom. Another area in which freedom poses deep problems in education is in people's wish to be free from the truth. In Florida, the Don't Say Gay bill is a deeply troubling example of limitation on educational freedom due to some people's wish that their children can be raised free from what the parents find undesirable. Teachers are not permitted, under such educational policy, to speak about their own lives when their sexual preferences differ from heterosexual relationships. After the murder of George Floyd, furthermore, over 70 bills throughout the United States explicitly forbade the discussion of critical race theory in schools, though virtually no curriculum mentioned it, and discussion had yet really to begin about how to take more responsibility about the problems of race in America. These restrictions conflict with Dewey's idea that one of the purposes of schools is to liberate students from the constraints of their local communities. Several problems arise within the broader concern about freedom from the truth. Teachers are yet again constrained, are unfree to address real problems in their classrooms. Some skeptics may think that is reasonable, as teachers, like anyone, can have agendas and aims beyond their purview. The problem here is that students come to them, teachers, with questions, concerns, crises. Shackling teachers with such limits prevents them from recognizing, addressing, and supporting the incredible variety of students whom they teach. With threats of termination, teachers' academic freedom has been constrained to such a level that they are to submit scripts of what they will cover and are expected not to diverge from them. This is not a joke. My students have shown me the scripts that they've had to submit. Due to my students, I teach graduate students who are teachers, some of them. Right? Due to accountability culture and the constraints of bills and laws like those that I mentioned. Who would want to be a teacher in these circumstances, let alone a student? It is no surprise that America faces a troubling teacher shortage when teachers are not treated with respect real professionals. They're comparatively poorly paid, and they're not trusted either with freedom to talk about what they believe they should, nor to address the special and varied concerns that their students bring. Another problem that arises in the cause for freedom from the truth is that parents take their kids out of public schools in several ways, some in private schools, others in homeschooling. Some of my own students have reported that they were placed in the school that they were, or homeschooled, so that they could avoid instruction about evolutionary theory. In the norm of leaving others alone and of not meddling, we can find the problem of an electorate ignorant of the incredibly well-established science that has convinced the Vatican that human beings develop through an evolutionary process. But not randomly. That's the difference. Science education and understanding is thereby set back, and people who are or will become voters affect others negatively as a result of their ignorance. Even worse are those cases of gross negligence about which change is profoundly needed. I told you I'd end with the grossly unjust. As Tara Westover illustrates in her powerful yet tragic memoir, Educated, a memoir, some children are raised under conditions called homeschooling, but eventually with zero oversight. I've had some terrific students who were homeschooled. Let me add that. But if there's no oversight, the result can be tragic, leading to the gross neglect of young people's education. Westover asks, provoking at least in me a stomach-wrenching guilt, why did no one care about my education? Why did she not deserve a proper education? A few brilliant stars like her and Frederick Douglass can overcome incredible odds and write beautifully. But many options for her life were foreclosed, however, by her family's choice to homeschool in a state with nearly no oversight about kids' homeschooling. One solution would be to imagine what well-regulated freedom could mean in homeschooling. It would be problematic, however, and to be sure, if the state merely made sure that homeschooled students bore the same oppressive pressure to perform on a standardized test in their curriculum. Little or no better than what some public schooling requires. At the same time, society has an obligation for all its children. This is a tension that John and I have talked about in the past, where, there's differences of opinion about whether only individuals can have obligations or whether they can be shared. Yes, parents have obligations too, but as Rousseau argued, quote, no one, not even the father, has a right to command the child what is not for his good, end quote. A final challenge to the cause for freedom, to the norms of embracing diversity, is the problem of unregulated charter schooling. In Arizona especially, charter schools have taken to be an educational policy mechanism, allegedly allowing freedom, experimentation, and innovation based on the powers of the competitive market. The problem is that smart business persons learned quickly that they could fail students radically, sell the buildings they were given, and walk away with filled pockets. This has happened. The unregulated charter school market has led to abysmal performance in for-profit online high schools. Unwitting politicians accept the norms of the powers of the market to enable savvy entrepreneurs to fleece the public and not only fail students but positively harm them, setting them back educationally. Freedom and variety are essential in education, yet when misunderstood, these norms can cause harm. At the same time, we philosophers can pronounce values of how things ought to be done. Education is important, but it's important to think about how one can translate these philosophical insights into operationalized behaviors. What do we tell the school teacher or school principal who is pressured to raise test scores? How do we shift the pressures and reward mechanisms that presently silence teachers and narrow the curriculum and steer school activities away from freedom and towards standardization and conformity? These questions are essential, yet are all too often ignored. Philosophers interested in public engagement and in having philosophy make a difference must get our hands dirty and immerse ourselves in the real day-to-day activities at work and the demand that democratic societies raise for compulsory universal education. In doing so, however, we would indeed be wise to promote freedom in such a way that it enables and empowers the diversity of flourishing. The end.